Professor Aklujkar, then I'll try to repeat the presentation in English in order that he can know what I'm saying. Bom, eu gostaria de agradecer imensamente a presença do professor Ashok Aklujkar, da Universidade da Colômbia Britânica, no Canadá, em Vancouver. O professor Aklujkar é natural da Índia, do estado do Maharashtra, né? E ele fez a sua formação acadêmica parte na Índia, a segunda parte dela do doutorado em diante nos Estados Unidos. Ele obteve o seu doutorado na Universidade de Harvard com o famoso professor Daniel Ingalls, e seu doutorado foi a respeito da obra do filósofo e gramático Bhartrhari, filósofo que atuou provavelmente no século V da era cristã, e ele tem, durante especialmente o período dos anos 70 e 80, ele trabalhou bastante publicando artigos a esse respeito. Ele tem trabalhado na produção de uma edição crítica monumental da obra completa de Bhartrhari, que será publicada, não se sabe bem quando, em provavelmente cerca de 12 volumes, e conterá toda a obra de Bhartrhari, ou seja, os 3 livros da Trikandi ou Akyapadiyam, junto com todos os comentários antigos de que se tem notícia e cujos fragmentos são existentes. O professor Aklujkar também tem trabalhado bastante em artigos de divulgação sobre cultura indiana, de uma maneira geral. Ele é convidado a visitar as universidades em várias partes do mundo. Ele já trabalhou na Alemanha com o Wilhelm Rau, ele trabalhou no Japão com os estudiosos da Universidade de Kyoto, em outras partes, em Tóquio, em muitos lugares. E basicamente sempre que alguém precisa ler algum texto gramatical, toca um telefonema para Vancouver e tenta se obter a ajuda do professor Aklujkar. Isso foi o que eu fiz no ano de 2009, quando eu precisava estudar o Akyapadiyam, que é o texto que eu tenho estudado desde então, e passei com ele um ano em Vancouver lendo o primeiro livro desse texto. Ultimamente o professor Aklujkar tem se preocupado bastante com a questão da cronologia da história e da literatura indiana em termos bem amplos, especialmente da questão da cronologia da filosofia indiana, e como essa cronologia, de certa maneira, é decisiva para o entendimento conceitual que acompanha o movimento do pensamento na Índia. E ele tem publicado alguns artigos sobre esse tema. Eu sei que tem trabalhado sobre isso, embora eu nos últimos tempos não tenha tão de perto acompanhado o seu trabalho desde que voltei ao Brasil. De qualquer maneira, eu mais uma vez agradeço a presença dele. Ele vai proferir a palestra. Let just me remind the title is Indian Philosophy as Part of Global Philosophy. So, a filosofia indiana como parte da filosofia global, que acho uma temática extremamente importante e que tem exatamente tudo a ver, né, com o nosso problema aqui, de uma maneira de encaixar, e conseguir ler a filosofia indiana não só a partir dos nossos parâmetros de leitura, mas expandindo os nossos parâmetros de leitura já estabelecidos. Just to say a little bit in English, I thank Professor Aklujkar for coming here. We are very glad that he could come. It's a pleasure for me, who had the pleasure to study with him. So I'm not gonna repeat all that I said about his education. So you already know it. Of course, he knows much better than all of us. And he's now going to proceed to the lecture. Thank you very much, Professor. I'm very happy that you came.
I knew you were saying something nice. So.
I think it was nice.
Thank you very much. I'm going to read the part and then speak extempore on some other individual details and so on. I wish to begin by thanking Adriano Apeliano, Lucas Machado, Joan Gonçalves, and Bruno Barot for making arrangements for my travel and for looking after my needs once I arrive here. Professor Sakrini also deserves my thanks for demonstrating once more in global history that the pen is mightier than the sword. Without his signature, the young scholars I just mentioned would not have had the opportunity to do what they did. I am sorry that I cannot present my thoughts before you in Portuguese. I'll try to speak clearly and slowly. If you do not understand any word I use, please write it down as closely as possible and ask me to explain it after my talk is over. I am happy that Brazil has succeeded in creating a mechanism for a collective study of non-Western philosophy. The opportunity to meet co-workers in the field and engage in a dialogue or discussion is very valuable, especially in a large country like Brazil, in which scholars sharing interests can frequently be situated in institutions of higher learning that are usually much removed from each other. So I congratulate you on the association you have formed, and I wish the association great success to come in the future. My use of non-Western in making the point I just made provides a good launching pad for what I wish to achieve through my presentation today. The expression indicates that the habit into which we have fallen of taking Western as a point of reference, as a starting point in the discussion of many an important phenomenon in our cultural life, especially when we wish to survey or study that phenomenon historically. Why we should always think of the Western as something in the background, why we are not free to start from the other side in most cases. That's really an important phenomenon in our present day situation that needs to be explored and kept in mind most of the time when we present philosophical ideas and so on. It is not difficult to understand for anyone familiar with recent economic and political order of the world why we should give priority to Western, why we should think of Western as somehow taking precedence over other possibilities. As I will try to show, we must ensure at the same time that the understandable mindset does not mislead us, and that with non-West, that is the East, is at least occasionally given a chance to stand up and breathe freely without the West breathing down its neck. For the last several years, I have been making an effort to move in the indicated direction. While teaching two courses on Indian philosophy in the Department of Asian Studies and the Department of Philosophy in my university, one course on the philosophical wisdom of India, covering Vedism, early Pali Buddhism, and early Magadhi Jains, and in the other course covering the Buddhist, Jains and Brahmins in interaction, where there are logical debates with each other and specific issues such as the nature of the self and the thesis of momentariness and so on, were actually covered through translations of the original text. So these two courses I taught for many years, and while doing that I frequently became aware of the problems with which I am going to deal as fully as possible today. I have much ground to cover, and by its very nature my paper requires it of me that I engage in consideration of usual ways of approaching Indian philosophy, the condition of teaching ancient languages such as Sanskrit, Pali and Prakrit inside and outside of India, issues of chronology and history. Each of such topics would ordinarily require a long essay of their own, if not a whole book, if it were to be thoroughly discussed. Further, any ensuing discussion will be complex, involving many proper names and sub-issues of detail and methodology. Since my intention is not to confuse or overwhelm you, not to give you a feeling of drowning in detail, I will in many instances simply give you my conclusions. Simply give you my conclusions and move ahead to what I mainly wish to achieve through my presentation. If in the question and discussion time you want to ask me about these issues, I'll be happy to provide certain details. This may initially, that is my procedure, may initially lead some of you to think that I am taking a bigger bite than I can chew, or I am simply asserting and acting like a non-philosopher. Philosophers are usually supposed to give reason, argumentation, you may think at some points I'm evading my responsibility as a philosophy teacher. Let me assure you that that's not my intention. I have already studied the details. The question or difficulty is how much do I present here? And since all of you have different backgrounds, instead of guessing something and presenting too much on a particular topic, I will cover the general points first, and wherever you wish to disagree with me or you have information to the contrary, please feel free to say. This is something work in progress, so I will be quite happy to give my understanding. There is a group of Indologists at present to whom anyone advocating a reconsideration of some important issues bearing on a number, holding a number of implications, becomes by that very act, by that very word reconsideration, or well, the other word is rewriting. As soon as that word is used, there are several established academicians who are taken aback, who are surprised, who think that the person is going to say something that no respectable historian would say. That is frequently a situation, especially in India. Some views have been taught for such a long time in textbooks and lectures by established academicians, established professors, who express them very nicely, beautifully, but occasionally, in my view, they are wrong views, historically not supported. So the battle I have to fight is an uphill battle, and in that case, it is very easy for someone asking for reconsideration or reformatting to be branded as following a particular religious agenda or nationalistic agenda. That is very commonly done. And right now the situation in Indology is such that many well-known historians, instead of engaging the other side in the details of the argument, will simply say that's a Hindutva thing. And Hindutva has become almost a death word. It's like pronouncing a death sentence on someone. This should not be the case. The professional historians should be open to the possibility that even in the other camp there can be a lot of variation. You can have some absolutely incompetent historians, you can have foolish Hindutvavadians, you can have absolutely ignorant Hindutvavadians, but what the label is doesn't matter. What the arguments, the evidence they present should matter. And the professional historians, the mainstream historians or established historians, whatever you would like to call them, should have the patience at least to look at the evidence. And this is unfortunately not happening in many cases. Simply a label is used, or you do not expect this of established academicians, but no honorable treatment to the other side is given. And usual tactics of saying someone is not a professor at a university, he is a banker or something like that. The other tactic is to say that he has not read such and such book published in a European language other than English. So the French history book on India or a German history book on India is not very much likely to be read in India. And therefore saying, as if just mentioning this omission is a full argument against the other party. Obviously it is not. That is, you can say, read this book again and write your thing again, or let me give you what this book says, and if you have anything to say in response, do say it. But that kind of civil treatment is becoming very difficult in this field. And the other tactic used is to concentrate not on the cumulative evidence, not on the whole argument given, but just select a few parts and pretend as if by their refutation everything else has been refuted. The other phenomenon I notice is concentrate on the externals of the essay or book that the other side has written. Externals such as it has bad printing, English is not very satisfactorily written, the diacritical marks are not used, all such things. Yes, for a good scholarly presentation, these things are necessary, they have their own place, but you still have to come to the substance of the thing at some point, and not just external features such as this. But everything like this is happening, and some of you may express disbelief at this, but I have first-hand experience of this. I have made notes of this phenomenon. Unfortunately, it's a reality of the field. Now, let me, first of all, to make my discussion easy later on, let me give you a sort of general picture of the current situation in the study of Indian philosophy, in the study of Indian philosophy as a part of global history of philosophy. Normally it is said that philosophy began in Greece. Thales was the first real philosopher, so to speak of, in the 7th century BC. And the Greeks had a particular openness to other cultures. The Greeks were very proud that they had this very valuable cultural entity called philosophy, and therefore they were open-minded people. They were in favor of pursuit of philosophy without any practical gain in mind. Philosophy was a big fruit in itself. It was a very valuable result to achieve in itself. This was their view, and they thought that this openness was the distinguishing feature of their culture. So this is one thing that is studied in the history of philosophy very frequently. Then the other question is about the Indian tradition, the Egyptian tradition, the Jewish tradition, and so on. And it is said, yes, the Greeks had relations with them, but the Greeks did not borrow anything truly essential for philosophy from them. The other traditions appear on the scene as philosophical traditions at a later point. There is nothing earlier than 7th century BC which could be called truly philosophical, and therefore would antedate what the Greeks achieved. This is a general historical stance. Then what about the teaching of philosophy? You would expect that in India, where naturally more people study languages like Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit, you would expect that there would be Indian scholars who go to the primary sources, who revisit the issues again and again, see if there is something new to be said about some important historical matter, and bring it afresh to the ideas, to the world of scholars. Unfortunately, in India, you can have even a doctorate in Indian philosophy with only English sources as your materials. And even in my university in Canada, we would not allow an MA thesis to be written on such a topic without the student having at least a reading knowledge of Sanskrit. This is what we do. Why in India this has been removed as a condition, I just don't understand. The argument that I hear occasionally is that everything worthwhile has already been translated. The translations have been done by great scholars such as Max Muller, who could write very accurately in English and the languages that we understand. So there is no need to go back to the primary sources. It's very difficult to understand how university people can make this argument. But it is made. And this is a sad state of Indian educational system. Whenever I go, of course, I make an argument against it, and I say, even if a new leaf of evidence is discovered, you should be studying it. You should be working out its implications. You may not turn the world around, but at least you will have something more in support of what you have been teaching your students. But that message somehow has not resulted in a significant change in policy. And the situation is that actually much original work on Indian philosophy is being done outside India. I don't mind that. That is, as long as good people doing it, competent people do it, it's fine. But that India should not be doing it is still a handicap, because manuscripts are in India. Possibilities for discovering new materials are in India. Indian philosophy is a living tradition in India. It's not like Greek philosophy. That is, at a certain point in history it comes to a halt. It is you still find philosophers heatedly debating with each other issues. There are several establishments where annual, what is called Shastrartha Charcha takes place. So it's the discussion of philosophical issues. And you have very few traditional pundits of great reputation left, but they are still there. And they can think in Sanskrit originally, they can write works in Sanskrit originally, and they can come up with new arguments. They are, if someone acquaints them with Western philosophy, they are willing to think of Indian philosophy from that point of view and write a new work in Indian philosophy. Just to give you one example, the notion of proposition does not exist in the Indian philosophical tradition. And actually modern analytical philosophy mostly points out that it was not that useful a notion anyway. That is, once you get into proposition, you get into problems of synonymy, you get into problems of how to define meaning and so on. And analytical or linguistically oriented philosophy already does that. So this notion is not going to achieve something very different and very significant. But if you tell an excellent traditional pundit in India, this is a notion found in the Western tradition called proposition. It doesn't exist in your tradition. The truly gifted pundit, desirous of enriching his knowledge, he will say, please explain to me what this notion is. And then if you give 5 sentences and say, well, John reads a book and the book is read by John, the sentences are different but the proposition is the same. So they will then say, okay, this is what you have in mind. And they will actually write an essay on this. And Badrinath Shukla of Varanasi actually wrote an essay on this. So you will find that there is a lively tradition. And why should Indian educational system treat this as a kind of dead wood and something that has been exhausted, some completely mined through translations such as English? On top of this, we have a real important epistemological problem. There are no equivalents in any other language of the world for certain Sanskrit, Pali and Prakritic equivalents. For very significant notions of Indian philosophical world, dharma cannot be translated with religion. You see, dharma has, of course, a great overlap with the concept of religion, but dharma is a much broader concept than religion. Dharma starts from the individual and goes to society. Religion starts with society and goes to an individual. So this is a very significant difference. Similarly, you cannot translate karma. Similarly, you cannot translate, there are very interesting absences on the Sanskrit side also. That is, Sanskrit has no words for an individual in the sense of an individual person and society. There are words, of course, which come close. You can use a word like samaja for society, but it did not in ancient times have the same meaning as community. There is consequently very little discussion of human rights in general under the term human rights. There will be a discussion. There are human rights. There are rights given to individuals, but they will appear in a different context. And what we should be doing in this case is saying differences are more interesting. Differences are more educational for both traditions. Indians should see, the traditional scholars of India should see why the Western tradition has these different key notions in their view of the world, in their discussion. And Western scholars should see why is it that they have dharma and we have religion. Why is it that we attach so much importance to religion but we have really no way of fully understanding dharma. We grope around that full understanding of dharma. So these are the very instructive differences, and the scholars on both sides should be pursuing those differences instead of superficial similarities. That's not happening. And the other thing is, even in teaching, if you have not included certain passages, certain texts from the original text, if you teach Sanskrit, for example, without taking any passages from Shankaracharya or from any other culturally important philosopher, where are the students going to get the sense of the context in which philosophy is? Where are they going to see how the same or apparently the same notions figure in different contexts and perform very interesting social functions, very interesting cultural achievement or absences of achievement. So it's a very significant epistemological consideration in methodology that you have to try to enter the ancient text, you have to reconstruct their world, and then in that reconstructed world you have to make sense of the text. It's of course, a mutually dependent process. There is some circularity in it, but there is no other way. If you have lost direct access to a particular cultural universe, the only thing you can do is understand its text properly, constantly keep on like a tennis game or a badminton game where the ball or the shuttle goes this way and that way. In the same way, you will have to come up with better translations, more accurate understandings of text. They will improve your understanding of the cultural context. Improved cultural understanding will improve your translations and understanding of the text. This is the intellectual excitement, this is the intellectual challenge that a society should constantly be undertaking. And that is not happening. See, that's one thing. On the Western side, after Hegel, somehow the Western academia has come to believe that there is no real philosophy. That somehow pursuit of knowledge for the sake of knowledge is not there. Somehow the sense of openness to different views is not there. And this is, first of all, in the history of Western philosophy, this is a false understanding. That is, as Halfas has pointed out, posthumous writings of Hegel did indeed come close to admitting that there is philosophy. But in his time, there were only a few texts available in translation. And he had very limited data, very limited body of works to work with. And naturally he thought if you have a text like the Gita, Bhagavad Gita, then it begins in a sort of religious covering. You have a divine hero giving some teaching to a warrior, there is a story associated with, there is an element of myth in some parts of the work, and so naturally the tendency is there is no pure philosophy. This is part of religion, this is part of mythology. Now, but if you look at the Gita, most of the chapters are actually analytical philosophy in many ways, analyzed philosophy in many ways. That is, you have a notion of three strands, you have a notion of what is ethical, what is not ethical. You have many varieties, many branches of philosophy covered in the work. And only superficial impression would be that there is no philosophy. So the reality is that philosophy appeared in a different context. The book covers were different, but the content was the same. And Hegel did realize, according to Halfas's account, in works that were published after his death. But the Western academic world still, especially philosophy departments, are very reluctant to change. That is, many excellent scholars like Karl H. Potter, Jitendranath Mohanty, Vimal Matilal, just to speak of the last 20, 30 years or 50 years, have tried, have demonstrated that there is very subtle logical philosophy, there is semantics, there is hermeneutics, there is a very significantly different philosophy of aesthetics and so on. There is ethics, although scattered over several works. But the Western academics in the philosophy department particularly are very reluctant to hear. The situation only changed to the extent they will listen to you respectfully. But yet we have to have philosophers, professors in philosophy departments on a large scale, not individually, on a large scale saying this is an important, but the Indian tradition is an important heritage of humanity. Just as we teach Greek philosophy, we should be teaching Indian philosophy. Our coverage should have a broader background. And now there is enough material available in European languages, particularly in English, on the basis of which they can easily make the case to university administration and so on, But this kind of feeling of nearness, this kind of feeling that something important is at stake if we do not act, that is missing. That kind of fire in the belly is missing. And that it should not be created even after 250 years of study of Sanskrit and such material is really amazing. So on the Indian tradition side, if you have bad educational policies, not really doing justice to bright students, not giving them scope for originality and so on the Western side you have closed-minded academics. That, as a generalization, the situation is changing, I do not deny that, but it's changing very slowly. And so here is a tradition which actually, as anyone who enters it can see, is extremely rich, extremely useful, important, strikingly different, and therefore significant, and it suffers both from the Indian side and the Western side. That is the practical situation for different reasons. So we have to find a way out of this. And I'll come to that, what things we can immediately do, I'm going to come to that. But on this background, on this overall background, we have to see now whether, what place in Indian tradition rightfully deserves in the global history of philosophy. First of all, this crucial question that is Greek philosophy the oldest tradition? And here, I do not particularly attach great value to being first in something. This is, and especially this is not being first in tennis, for being first in cricket, or for being first in football. It's not like that. It's being first or having a chronology determined is important because it gives us better chances of accurate interpretation of ancient texts and ancient schools of thought. That is why it's important. Being first in itself will please only a nationalist. And that's not the way I have in mind, because nationalism always leads to blind judgments and denigration of the other and so on. And I'm sure no one in this room wants to reach that kind of low level of discussion. So that's not something important. But we have to take up this issue, and you will find the general picture presented is this, that until the attempted invasion of Alexander the Great or Alexander the Macedonian, there was hardly any contact between the Greeks and the Indians. And after his attempted invasion, somehow people began through commerce and political exchanges of ambassadors and so on to come to know each other better. They had better knowledge of each other, and therefore Greek tradition, which was already in existence for 5-6 centuries, Alexander in 3rd century BC, Theos in 7th century, so let's say at least 4 centuries. The Greek tradition, which had established itself for about 4 centuries, began to influence the Indian tradition. And therefore what our Sanskrit scholars do is that first impulse is to date a work after the 4th or 3rd century BC. It is generated. Now this is such a general, spacious argument that we would say, ordinarily we would say, no, show some concrete objective evidence. Just appealing to a historical period as proving the lateness or early age of a work is not satisfactory. It's too general a way of approaching the problem. This should be our first reaction. But since Indian scholars don't study the Greek tradition, and since historians are studying through English materials most of the time, the repetition of the same dates, the repetition of the same estimates of the age of the work takes place. First of all, we have to see the weakness of the argument that I presented just now. At least it should create a sense of healthy uncertainty in our mind. If we are not convinced that India has a better claim for more ancient philosophical thought, at least we should say the present construction needs to be revisited again and again, and we need to reconsider it, and at some point we should be willing to change our estimate. First of all, there should be some sort of unity in the Greek tradition, so that in another country it will be received something close to a single tradition, something identifiable with a community or a country or a region. The Greek tradition of the early Christian, early pre-Christian eras, pre-Christian century, is extremely diverse. That is, yes, the Greeks were philosophers, they had openness of spirit and other things, very remarkable things. But what is it that they could have presented to India as our premier teaching, our most distinctive teaching, something that describes our national identity? When you read these accounts of early Greek philosophy, nothing comes across as really single school or single way of dealing with things. There are significant similarities with early Indian philosophy. For example, Socrates, as far as we know, did not give a single consistent statement on what is self. But if you take all his pronouncements as preserved by Plato into account, you will see that self is something permanent. Self is something that is uniquely capable of cognizing itself. That is, there is some kind of the normal relationship that there is a subject and there is an object, and the subject comprehends or perceives or cognizes the object. That is said to be suspended in the case of the self. The self is self-luminescent, in other words. While it cognizes other things, it is cognized itself. So in that sense, it's a very distinctive kind of substance, if at all we could call it substance. So that idea is common. Then there is a sense that somehow truth is not just a matter of worldly benefit. The truth is, that is, being truthful means better standard for the community, everyone benefits, there is mutual trust, there is greater peace in society. Of course, these worldly benefits are there, of ethical behavior or truthful behavior. But truth is also viewed as a force, as something like a physical force, something like gravity, something like electricity. That is, truth can bring about change in physical reality. So the kind of ascetic power on the Indian side, being truthful is a form of religious practice. Being truthful is a form of creating a particular positive force in the world. So that again is similar. So when you have many such crucial things shared by ancient Greek philosophy and the ancient texts in India, then you should at least be open to the possibility that the two traditions could have come into contact with each other earlier. Their relationship could have been deeper than just similarity of their languages. Their relationship could have been gone before. So this is one other argument. The lack of absolute unity in what was presented as Greek philosophy, then the similarity of some crucial ideas on both sides, which indicate a possible common origin, that should make us stop. The third thing is, Alexander went to India as a military conqueror. He took at least two people who were interested in finding out Indian philosophy. Now, that is, they went and he deliberately went in search of Indian holy men, Indian philosophers, what they called gymnosophists. That was the Greek rendering of whatever person they were looking for. And they found one Kalanos, they found one Bandanos. These were more, from their accounts, these people seem to be more on the religious side than on the philosophical side. But that was probably not intended as the whole description. And it is said that Kalanos wanted to show that human mind can conquer human body. And at some point, he accompanied the retreating army of Alexander. At some place when he thought he had diseases, life had become miserable for him, he simply said, create a funeral pyre for me. I want to burn my body. And in front of Alexander's army, he burned himself. And they said there was no, the accounts say, there was no indication of pain, there was no indication of doing something extraordinary in his behavior. So he is depicted as a sort of religious person, but would his philosophy of living be there unless there was some other philosophy in India? And why would Alexander bring two people whose mission was particularly to go in search of Indian religious men, holy men, general sophists, whatever you may call them? So some news must have reached Greece before Alexander that there was a philosophy in India. Also, we know, although historians of philosophy do not refer to this fact, that Darius or Dharayavasu, the king of Persia in 6th century BC, he had Indian soldiers in his army. He had Ionian soldiers in his army. How far likely is it that they would not exchange ideas, they would not converse with each other? So if this can happen in 6th century BC, and you have the mention of Alexander particularly looking for philosophers, it's obvious that at least indirectly there was some information about Indian philosophical traditions in Alexander's time, in Alexander's Greece. So taking all these things cumulatively, we should no longer be saying that the first contact of philosophers philosophically thinking people between India and Greece took place after Alexander's attempted invasion. There are so many pieces of evidence, quite explicit, quite believable in terms of their simplicity. They are not appealing to any miracles, nothing like that. So why shouldn't we be at least open to the alternative possibility that the Greeks themselves thought of philosophy, what they called philosophy, as essentially existing in other countries, particularly India and Egypt, from the accounts that are available. So that is what we have to keep in mind. This is where we have good reason to at least modify history, if not immediately go to the other side. So this chronology, this sequence needs to be changed. And after that, we have several Greeks coming to northwestern India, occasionally becoming followers of Indian religions and so on. They creating religious monuments. Many of them have been destroyed in the later centuries, but still enough survives to suggest that there was enough of a contact between the two cultures. In this way, the history writing should take new possibilities into account and change. Translations of Greek works into Sanskrit also should be done. This is one thing that will highlight the different ways of thinking. And then we will be able to see, in spite of linguistic similarity between Sanskrit and Greek, how the philosophical writings were different. What was it that philosophers did differently from ordinary authors of Greek, etc. That's worthwhile doing. Even in stories, that is, I gave you some clear historical evidence, but even in stories, the Greeks come across as looking up to India. There is an old story that says, and Socrates met an Indian in Athens, and the Indian asked Socrates, "What do you do?" And he said, "I think about human life." And the story goes, the Indian responded, "There's no point in thinking about human life unless you think of the other world." So, now that will, modern historians will say, "Well, didn't we tell you that Indians were always interested in religion? They were not interested in philosophy." Well, you could give that sort of interpretation for the story. But the fact is that this is a very legitimate position to take, that unless you have a reference point of the other world, you cannot fully discuss human life. You may not believe in the existence of the other world, that's another matter. But at the back of your mind, in the corner of your mind, somewhere there has to be this lurking notion of life after death, life in heaven, or life without any worldly bonds, moksha or nirvana, something like that. Then only this question, that also is a very defensible interpretation of this encounter of Socrates with an Indian philosopher. Right up to Neoplatonics, you have a tradition of Greeks wanting to go to India. And this is a reasonably long tradition. that it means that there was some continuation. Then you have Pythagoras, whose geometrical theorems, especially the theorem about the triangle, is found in Indian texts earlier. So historically, whether you give credit to Pythagoras first or to the author of the Shulva Sutras in the Indian tradition, that's a question. So you have several indications of continuing contact. Now, you may say the Indians took from the Greeks and they did not acknowledge. That's also possible. In some instances, that might have happened. But the Indians, whenever they took something from another country, they have usually given a name, associating with that country. For example, in astronomy, certain things did come from Greece to India, and there is a Yavana Siddhanta, Ionian Siddhanta in the Indian astronomical tradition. At a later time, the Indians have said late Shah, the Yavanas, they are more skilled in making machines than we are. So if it's a question of machines, consult a late Shah, not an Arya or a Brahmin. Okay. So this is how there is this kind of openness. Of course, ancient Indians were not nationalistic the way modern Indians are, because there was no notion of nation actually existed in the world. So you can see that all these pieces of evidence need to be considered, and we should entertain two different possibilities. There are significant differences in the two traditions, and I will just explain one bearing for history writing global history of philosophy. In writing the history of the Western tradition, we say that first of all, thinkers like Socrates were interested in epistemology. Then what we consider ontology was their secondary interest. And they were interested, philosophers like Aristotle were interested in categories, of which we find an analog in the Nyaya Vaisheshika, especially Vaisheshika tradition of India. So you have these correspondences, similarities, but on the whole, epistemology was more valued than ontology, and different philosophies came into existence. Some schools or some separate branches of philosophy, like philosophy of politics, philosophy of running a government, that we find in Greece, is not found as a separate pursuit of knowledge in India. It is there, the thought is there. In Mahabharata is full of it, Kautilya Shastra is full of it. There are 20 Sanskrit texts that will give you the major points of political philosophy. But it doesn't appear as a separate book or separate branch of knowledge. Such situations also exist. The big difference is the Indian philosophical tradition starts with language. See, right from the Vedas, there is attention to language. And that ultimately culminates in the philosophers actually anticipating what we associate with Wittgenstein. That is, philosophical problems, to the extent they are genuine, are solved by analysis of language. And whatever can be solved by just analysis of language is not a genuine philosophy. And this is how philosophical problems, most of them can be dissolved rather than solved. This is a famous, very well-known development for modern period of Western philosophy. But it's not until the beginning of the 20th century that this central role of language is brought to bear upon philosophical issues in the Western tradition. There are a few instances in medieval philosophy here and there, but nothing that was consistently pursued. So in India, however, the situation is different. In the Veda, the oldest available document, we have a whole hymn dedicated to speech. And speech there appears there, which is not philosophical idiom used there, but speech says, I am the master of everything. All gods are under my control. I am the God of gods. And that is, you won't think of the gods unless you think through me. So essentially the same idea of the centrality of language is there, although it's not very clearly philosophical. But we have an early text saying mind and language are not different things. A deeper level of language, Madhyama or Pashyanti, is really language, not mind. And Shatapatha Brahmana says, Mana eva vak, vak eva mana. So they say this duality of language and mind is to be preserved because it makes discussion possible. Without duality, you cannot discuss any monistic philosophy. And therefore, you have to keep it, you have to maintain the duality, but at some point you have to collapse mind with language and language with mind. So this again is found in text that probably goes back to 1100 BC, but it could be even, there could be debate about the dating of the text. Anyway, but it's fairly ancient. Then you have later on a great cultivation of grammar in India. Unlike any other ancient civilization in the world, Indians have paid attention to sound and language. And you see that in Indian music, that you see in mantra philosophy, you see the Om philosophy that you heard the presentation this afternoon. So there is a sustained tradition. And thinking of language as consisting of 4 layers, with having 4 stages, which is quite sophisticated philosophy, and it's continuously maintained in the Indian tradition. Whereas in the Western side, we come to think of language as closely related to philosophy only recently. And first of all, philosophers begin to think of individual expressions, then they get into a discussion of creating artificial languages in the time of Karmat and others. Then you find kind of divide between Strawson and Quine, that is whether you should think of individuals or you should think of universals. Then you have Chomsky's general thinking about language being native to innate to human beings and others. And you have all these views quite clearly stated in Indian texts. The context is different, the use to which these views are put, that is different, but they are stated with absolute clarity. Even with the literal translations of sentences, you will arrive at these meanings in many Indian texts. So this is the continued thread. And that indicates then another way why the Indian philosophy had a more ancient and a very distinctively different, interestingly different kind of starting point. If you look at the Veda now, most of our historians would say there is a chronology. First there were the Samhita type of Veda, then the Brahmana type of text, the Aranyaka type, and the Upanishad type. This is how they see. Actually, when the earliest Aranyakas, Upanishads, etc. began to appear, we may not be having them in the original form, we may have the forms with increments and so on. But when they begin to appear, there must have been a philosophy for text. The Rig Veda gives you a text for what we would call religious acts, rituals and rites and so on. The Brahmanas give you a procedure. The Aranyakas and Upanishads try to give the underlying meaning of it. So it's not something that you have mere blind, through mere mechanically repeated text, and then philosophers, certainly people think, why are we doing this? And then they get into philosophy. That would be a crude reconstruction of history of philosophy. When the Vedic Samhitas were put together, by the very fact that all of these are arranged for practical needs of society indicates that they have a philosophy. And in that sense, the Vedanta, this is where I would say something different from what you might have heard earlier. That is, Vedanta does not originally mean end of the Veda in a physical or temporal sense. That is, Vedanta is not something which is at the end of the Veda library. The image you should not have it that there are, suppose, all books called Veda are arranged on the shelf, and somehow Vedanta books come at the end. That sort of image you should not have. You should not also have the image that first the Samhitas were written in total absence of philosophical thought, metaphysical speculations, something like that, and only the Upanishads appeared only later. The Brahmanas appeared only later. Vedanta, right from its first use, datable use or ancient use, means conclusion of the Vedas. Okay, so Anta there has already acquired the secondary sense of conclusion. And therefore you had texts that were recited at religious rites, texts like Brahmanas that gave you the procedure of rites, and Aranyakas and Upanishads gave you the thought that was claimed to be based on the Vedas. It may not in all instances be based directly on the Vedas, but the hermeneutical way of taking the literal meaning of the Veda and then developing the philosophy on the basis of that had already come into existence. And that's why they are Vedanta. And Upanishads and Vedanta are not exact synonyms in the beginning. Upanishads are texts that give you significant philosophy. Something that should not be indiscriminately shared. So Upanishad has the primary sense, secret knowledge. Knowledge not to be indiscriminately given to only worthy persons, to be given to only worthy persons. So you have this sense of Upanishad preserved all the way to our times. Especially in 16th century, when the son of Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, Dara Shikoh, he was a more liberal-minded of the Mughals, and he composed one Allopanishad. That is sort of secret mystical teaching regarding Allah. He was just giving the mystical part of the Islamic tradition in Sanskrit in this way. And you have several Upanishads in this way. They continue to be written almost up to the 17th century, composed. So you will see here our way of looking at Indian philosophy, its history has to change. I'm not saying all texts belong to the same time. I'm not saying all texts are equally ancient, but they are, in terms of content, much more closely related to each other. The Veda, the very ancient book of the Veda, like Rig Veda, already has some Vedanta content. That's how we should look at it. It may not be so explicitly and fully stated as in the later Upanishad, but it's there. And that's why in the Nasadiya Sutta and other things, skepticism and everything is expressed. So you will see that what was the starting point. Now, in the Western world, it is normally in history they say man was originally a primitive man. He was living in a simple society. He believed that there was some magic behind religion, natural phenomena. He was awed by magic. So they say, oh, there must, if it's a storm and very strong wind comes and uproots trees, can do something that I cannot as an individual do, not the strongest men of my community can do. There must be a wind god. There must be a rain god. There must be a sun god. This is how we begin to explain. And then we said man somehow became wiser and said, no, this is not a magical force, this is a natural force. The division between magical, mystical on the one hand and natural came into picture. And then later on people became much more sophisticated philosophers and so on. It might have happened this way in some parts of the world. It may be true of several primitive tribes that still exist, fortunately exist in our days, so that's possible. But there is in the Vedic tradition, this is not really primitive society. It's a very sophisticated society, and some societies have reached that stage earlier than other societies. That's the only difference. And what the question, instead of the question, who am I? What is this world? What is my position in this world? That is usually taken as the start of philosophical inquiry, philosophical curiosity. The Indian curiosity seems to have been different. What is the difference between a dead man and a living man? And whatever characterizes a living man is taken as something to be used for individual benefit, society benefit. And what are the signs? What are the differences? When a man dies, breath disappears, bodily heat disappears, procreative capacity disappears, and speech disappears. And this is what really marks the philosophical interest in the religion. It's of course expressed through mythology, and that shows that a great deal of elaboration of these ideas has taken place. This is the crucial point. When a person is living, we have all these activities, we are in true interaction with that person. Through speech, we come to know his condition. Through bodily heat, we come to see whether he is going to live or not. All these things happen. But once these signs end, we don't know to which word he or she has gone. We have no access, no communication of any kind. So these were the real important things. And that is why even in the ancient Vedic texts we have prana, watch, that is breath, language. All these are important considerations. So the starting points are different. That is what we should take into account. And as I said earlier, concern with language, which results in very important discoveries. For example, paradoxes is the point at which modern linguistic philosophy came to a sort of halt for a while. How to deal with paradoxes? That is, famous sentences like "everything I say is a lie," and then the question is this sentence to be considered a lie or not? If it's a lie, then the truth was not expressed, and if it's not a lie, then the content of the sentence is not to be accepted. It's not a valid sentence. So this is how you have paradoxes. In the Indian tradition of the grammarians, they came up with 4 possible answers to solve these paradoxes. One is, in all communication, intention of the speaker matters. Intention of the speaker matters. And when someone says, everything I say is a lie, the intention is everything except this sentence is a lie. Then there is no paradox. If you take the view that the real communication unit of language is sentence, not words, and sentences have a unity. Words we analyze for the sake of teaching language, for the sake of compiling dictionaries and so on, but it's really the sentence that is actually used for communication. And with the unity of the sentence, there are no different parts in the sentence. That means whatever the words individually convey is not to be taken into account. What the sentence as a whole conveys is to be taken into account. So even if the sentence is everything I say is a lie, there everything is not to be taken separately. That means that you don't take everything in its literal dictionary sense. You say again everything except what you are hearing right now. So the dictionary meaning is adjusted so that there will be no division within a sentence. That's secondly. Meaning of a word is not the actual physical thing. That's the third way. Meaning is somehow an image of a word, a meaning, the image of a thing, or just what is linguistically found to be different from the uttered word. So that's meaning. And therefore, here again, everything is not referring to some actual physical reality. Therefore, the sentence is not self-contradictory. The sentence is not paradoxical. So you will see this is how many solutions have already been found. Now, what this means is what the world in the Western tradition discovered in the 19th century, 20th century, has been anticipated at least in 4th, 5th century AD in India. And when I wrote this kind of thing, the letter to Wilhelm Quine, one of the well-known analytical philosophers, he wrote it back to me, and I preserved that letter. It was historical information. I didn't know I was anticipated 1500 years ago. But that's the mark also of a good scholar, great scholar. He did not say, I'm the first one to say, anything like that. But like a true philosopher, he said, I'm happy that I have been anticipated. So the histories have to be written differently, the starting points have to be reconsidered, and so on. Now, after all this, where I show the good points and the bad points, both traditions, we have, and on the handout, I have not really referred to the handout because that's where I'm going to mostly conclude. The question of relationship between Greek philosophy and Indian philosophy actually occurred at a very early time. I'm trying to find my handout. Yes. This information is from Halfas, a very good scholar of Indian philosophy. In 1877, Schaeffer was a student who wrote a thesis in Latin, and he at that time expressed the view that the Indian tradition was older, that the Greek tradition might have been inspired to some extent by the Indian tradition, and see how Halfas, whom I admire for many other things, how he rejects this conclusion. This conclusion should be rejected by going back to the text, pointing out why that one way would be to say that Schaeffer has misinterpreted the text do not mean what he said they mean. That would be the right way of rejecting it. Look at Halfas's paragraph there. It's simply a way of creating doubt, not really refuting. That's what we do. His thesis says that the doctrine of Oriental origin of Greek philosophy could also be found in the thoughts of the Greeks themselves, and then neither Schaeffer nor any other authors who wrote on this subject have been able to produce unambiguous testimony from classical times. This is simply say what they have proceeded is not, what they have provided is not really unambiguous. But exactly to what extent it's unambiguous, what the expressions are, a very detailed textual analysis of Schaeffer as well as the text he quotes should have been undertaken. It's just what even great authors in our tradition, Indological tradition, do, that to say that I'm not fully convinced, I don't think he has given enough evidence, that's all right. But not to get into the details of that evidence and just pass a general remark is not satisfactory. That's what we'll see. I don't have to read the whole thing. The same thing about some evidence coming from Megasthenes, who was an ambassador for Seleucus Nicator, an ambassador of an heir to Alexander's empire in northwestern India, and so on. So this is one thing. The second thing I would like to refer to is that a very extreme claim of Johannes Bronkhorst. That is, he says rationality arose only once in human history. Okay? And that arose among the Greeks. And from the Greeks, after Alexander, it came to Sarvastivadin Buddhists in northwestern India. And through their works, gradually it percolated in the Indian tradition. But first of all, what is the proof for saying rationality arose only once in human history? That is, this itself claim needs to be pointed out. And on the surface of it, I find it, I do not find it believable. That is, in some sense, rational thinking must have existed with human beings. As soon as two human beings came together, they have to settle their differences, and pretty soon they must have discovered that killing each other is not the way. So both have to survive, and they have to somehow decide whose view is better. How are they going to discuss, define this, find out whose view is better? There has to be some, at least undefined sense, unsystematized sense of logic, rationality, respect for objective evidence, and so on. There has to be something. So this is how it begins. Now this is fairly very late. That is, if you say rationality came in the 3rd century BC or 2nd century BC because of Greek influence, then you have a paragraph that I give on the back side, Aitareya Upanishad. This is, it says that, first of all, I give you a hint from the Rig Veda, where what you may not find in other traditions is found very early in Indian tradition. We don't know how this word is created. And they say, the first paragraph from the Rig Veda says, if you say accept the word of the gods for it, the gods are also after creation of the world. So how could they be taken as sure guides for how the world took its shape? Very healthy kind of skepticism is very clearly expressed. There is no other way to explain these lines that would be convincing. And then you come to Aitareya Upanishad, you will see here, if rationality did not exist, in this relatively old text, could we have this terminology like some jnana, vijnana, ajnana, very deliberately coined terminology, which shows that with the different prefixes the meanings of the words change, and all this is referring to different aspects of human knowledge. So not only knowledge has been studied, but it has been analyzed and different names have been given. And a very careful, deliberate terminology has been created. This is not a chance terminology. So how can one ignore such evidence and simply make these tall claims? So that's one thing. Now, I said I will say something about how we could change the situation. We should not just be pessimistic. I think one practical difficulty in India as well as outside is if you want to study something like Indian philosophy as a part of global heritage, then the problem of language learning is in there. So first of all, obviously, we have to find more efficient ways of teaching languages like Sanskrit, Pali, Prakrit. We have to devise different methods. That's obvious. I will not elaborate on that. Secondly, how many authors and how many works and how many languages can we expect of students? As long as we follow the format of a modern university, and we say generally a bachelor's degree is received in 4 years, we are always going to face this problem of how many things students can learn in 4 years. So why not think out of the box and say that we will begin to teach Indian and Greek philosophy, maybe philosophical works in Latin, at about the same time? Why not remove this artificial distinction between the Greek world and the Western world and Indian world? Why not take reliable translations and select only the works that are of crucial importance for the world as a whole, not guided by nationalistic considerations, not guided by a particular excessive faith in a particular tradition. Take Plato, take Yajnavalkya, take Kautilya, whatever it is, and create a kind of global syllabus for students. If on the side they want to learn Sanskrit, Greek, or some other language, Chinese, whatever it is, let them do it. But instead of halting all things, all progress, just because there are practical difficulties in teaching so many languages, why not start with what is directly useful, whatever is practical, but gives them a sense of the richness of the worldly philosophical scene. And instead of speaking of a national heritage and a global heritage, why not generally speak only of global heritage? That would be the way to break the impasse at which we find ourselves. Thank you for listening to me patiently, and I hope I have not been very unclear. I have taken a few more minutes than I needed. If necessary, you can translate it, summarize it in Portuguese, but if everything has been understood, please, we can just take the questions right away.
Eu vou perguntar se o público conseguiu seguir bem a palestra, senão eu posso fazer um pequeno sumário em português, em cerca de 10 minutos. Levantem as mãos, por favor.
Sumário é bom.
Seria bom? Então eu vou fazer, mas eu pediria antes que vocês aplaudissem o professor, já que ninguém aplaudiu. Thank you very much, Professor. I'll do like a 10-minute summary. They would like that, and then after that, we can go for the questions. Eu anotei tudo que eu pude. Vocês viram que eu estava aqui rabiscando tudo. Em primeiro lugar, a professora agradeceu a alguns indivíduos, né, que estavam aqui presentes. Dentre eles, eu mesmo. O Lucas é evidente que é um dos nossos organizadores aqui, o professor Marcos Sacrini, o João Carlos Gonçalves, professor de Censo aqui na faculdade, o Bruno Garrote. A partir daí, ele se fez a pergunta básica que levou a palestra dele, é a seguinte: por que o Ocidente, quer dizer, o Ocidente moderno, o europeu, deve ser tomado então como ponto de referência para tudo, né, no mundo moderno? E claro, no caso dele, para o âmbito do estudo da filosofia. Claro, ele deu uma resposta simples a isso, é uma questão da ordem mundial, tal como ela se apresenta. A academia hoje se fundamenta no mundo ocidental europeu, e essa é a ordem das coisas, e ela acaba influindo, então, digamos assim, lançando seus tentáculos para todos os lados e para todos os objetos que sejam estudados. Logo em seguida, ele falou rapidamente sobre a natureza do trabalho dele. Ele tem trabalhado com fontes do budismo, jainismo e brahmanismo. Ele acabou trabalhando, lecionando muitos cursos sobre esses temas na sua carreira universitária. E, claro, esse é um dos pontos que o fez também pensar sobre alguma nova proposição para a apresentação do estudo da filosofia sobre um parâmetro menos, digamos assim, nacional ou parcial. Em seguida, ele mencionou os assuntos acerca dos quais ele ia comentar, falou que ia falar um pouco da questão da filosofia, do estudo das línguas, e o problema acerca do qual ele se deteve mais tempo, que é o problema da cronologia. Ele passou a falar, então, dessa questão do problema da reescritura e da necessidade de reconsideração, que é basicamente uma reescritura da história da filosofia tal como ela se apresenta, e aí ele observa, quer dizer, há uma verdadeira batalha em jogo, pois há muita relutância, não só em reconsiderar, em considerar, né, a presença de elementos e de outras tradições não helênicas na fundação do problema da filosofia em si mesma, mas existe mesmo uma profunda vontade de não fazer a reconsideração. Quer dizer, é mais do que uma resistência, simplesmente dizer a história do jeito que está contada é suficiente. Então ele propõe um sentimento diferente, um sentimento de abertura, que também deverá se abrir para os elementos exteriores ao mundo da academia. E ele acabou se referindo ao problema que se vive hoje na academia internacional. Isso se vê muito, no Brasil se vê pouco, no âmbito do estudo da Índia, que é a questão das pessoas de fora da academia opinando sobre os assuntos históricos da filosofia indiana. Isso tem acontecido muito na Índia, né? E muitas vezes todas essas opiniões têm sido agrupadas numa espécie de balaio de gatos e recebido a nomenclatura de um certo nacionalismo indiano, termo que se usa hoje em Hindi é Hindutva, né? E basicamente a academia rejeitando, né, tudo que não venha de dentro da academia com esse rótulo, sem levar em consideração a substância dos argumentos, apenas levando em consideração, digamos assim, a aparência superficial, não acadêmica e, portanto, de difícil digestão para a academia. Então ele propõe que se rejeite esse preconceito e que se tente, pelo menos, levar em conta a substância dos argumentos dessas pessoas que, ligadas ou não ao nacionalismo, né, podem estar, de alguma maneira, trazendo uma reflexão que ainda não foi pensada, justamente por vir de um âmbito completamente distinto. Em seguida, ele apresentou o que seria um panorama, né, desse problema do início da filosofia na Grécia, né? e mencionou essa questão, acho que todos nós conhecemos bem, do porquê se entende que a Grécia é um dos inícios da filosofia, em virtude dessa consciência, né, que a cultura grega antiga apresenta, de que está criando algo, né, de que está fazendo está fundando, estabelecendo, instaurando um saber, e a isso dá um nome, e também o que se vê já de fora, como uma análise, que a cultura grega teria uma característica de abertura para o outro não identificável em outras tradições antigas. Então isso foi uma espécie de estopim também para a natureza, né, do pensamento filosófico grego, e para o fato de que esse pensamento se constitui como verdadeiramente filosófico, diferente dos outros, né? Então ele se pergunta, né, no caso das demais tradições, né, como é que nós vamos fazer, né? Elas ficam então totalmente de fora, quer dizer, nós devemos aceitar que nada foi feito anteriormente a Tales. Tales é o nosso ponto inicial, e essa história está fixada dessa maneira, está estabelecida. Então ele se propõe que é preciso reconsiderar justamente todo esse conjunto de fontes que aparentemente, segundo ele, está muito bem lido e interpretado, mas que talvez não seja assim, né? A seguir ele fez um pequeno panorama do problema que se vê hoje em âmbito indiano, na Índia, né? Essa situação do ensino da filosofia. A Índia, claro, depois do período colonial, acabou recebendo grande influência do ensino britânico, e acabou, digamos assim, tomando de maneira não crítica, né, os fundamentos, né, e a aplicação desses elementos conceituais que dão uma explicação de mundo para a sociedade moderna. E ele vê isso com grande tristeza. Ele acha que precisa se fazer um trabalho em âmbito indiano para modificar esse aspecto, e que para uma postura intelectual, poderia dizer assim, verdadeiramente indiana, saiba se distinguir dessa herança europeia que foi, de certa maneira, imposta, né? Além de falar isso, ele diz a razão disso, né, quer dizer, a razão de que a tradição indiana moderna deve se tomar uma posição é porque a filosofia tem um tipo ou isso que ele está chamando de filosofia indiana, a tradição indiana, é uma tradição viva, viva linguisticamente, quer dizer, o sânscrito é uma língua que ainda se usa em várias partes da Índia, no contexto do debate conceitual, e ainda se encontram lá o que seriam estudiosos, o que seriam filósofos modernos, utilizando essa língua oralmente e textualmente para a discussão de novos problemas que aparecem. E esse foi o momento em que ele fez aquela referência ao fato de que alguns pensadores modernos indianos que falam e escrevem em sânscrito mesmo se debruçaram, né, sobre algumas questões que lhes foram apresentadas de fora, quer dizer, do mundo europeu. Ele acha que esse modelo deveria ser um modelo que se transferisse, né, para o ensino geral, né, para, digamos assim, o sistema de ensino da Índia moderna, né. A partir daí, ele falou dessa questão, quer dizer, ele tomou esse problema como o estopim, quer dizer, aquilo que motiva, então, essa nova direção na pesquisa, pensar não nas similaridades que podem ser não tão importantes, mas no grande interesse que possuem as diferenças. Quer dizer, porque são diferentes que essas tradições então merecem um novo tratamento e uma nova releitura. A partir daí, ele falou dessa questão do estudo que está em volta desse problema. É claro, há uma exigência grande aí, que é o estudo da língua, né, e o estudo de uma epistemologia que dê conta de um trabalho como esse. E, claro, a partir daí também as novas tradições, um novo trabalho que foi feito é importante, é de valor, mas precisa ser repensado. Ou seja, é a ideia de que não se pense num trabalho pronto, mas que se produza de tempos em tempos uma continuidade. O trabalho tem que ser contínuo, nós não podemos parar nas opiniões só porque elas vieram de autoridades importantes, né? A partir disso, ele falou do problema ocidental, quer dizer, esse outro lado da questão, como uma coisa que é diferente, e digamos assim, a difícil e problemática influência que teve a opinião de Hegel na formação do nosso entendimento do que seria estudar o pensamento fora da tradição grega, né? Ele mencionou que o próprio Hegel, isso a partir de Hallfas, um autor que escreveu bastante sobre esse assunto, que foi citado na bibliografia, o próprio Hegel, e vocês que conhecem bem Hegel sabem, no fim da vida ele mesmo mudou um pouco de opinião, mas esses escritos parece que foram desconsiderados pela tradição filosófica moderna, e considerou-se apenas os escritos em que ele, digamos assim, rejeitava a filosofia indiana, né? Quer dizer, até nisso, né, a tradição ocidental tem um problema, porque rejeitou o seu próprio grande autor, em certo sentido, né? Essa piada é minha, ele não fez, né? Ou seja, nós estamos sempre lidando com um universo de dados limitados. Essa que é a questão. Tem que se aceitar que esses dados são limitados, e sendo limitados, já que são limitados, porque são limitados, é preciso nunca parar o trabalho de reflexão, né? A partir disso daí, ele falou, já que a coisa é assim, né, nós precisamos pensar na tradição indiana não como uma simples tradição alheia à tradição grega. Nós precisamos simplesmente modificar o ponto de vista. A questão não é haver uma tradição grega ou haver uma tradição indiana, mas se pensar que há uma tradição global de pensamento, na qual, e aí a imagem faço eu mesmo, nós teríamos os ramos, né? Um ramo indiano de extremada importância, um ramo grego que nós já sabemos bem e conhecemos a importância, mas tem um aí cuja importância precisa ser melhor conhecida, né? A partir disso, ele andou, né, para a sua conclusão desse caminho de concluir qual que é o lugar, então, da filosofia indiana no âmbito da filosofia global, e fez aquelas considerações em relação ao problema cronológico, especificamente, quer dizer, a invasão de Alexandre no século III a.C., seria então o estopim, quer dizer, seria aquilo que é o elemento causador do pensamento indiano, né? Nós podemos pensar dessa maneira. Quer dizer, é só possível uma filosofia indiana se ela for pensada a partir de um contato, algum tipo de contato com a filosofia grega. Ele apresentou alguns exemplos que infirmam, né, segundo a opinião dele, essa ideia, né, de que a filosofia indiana necessariamente precisasse ter um contato com alguma forma de pensamento grego para se desenvolver, né? Ele faz a menção, a partir disso, ao tipo de problema que se encontra com mais frequência nessa filosofia grega mais antiga, e aliás se referiu ao período que nós chamamos de clássico, né, o período socrático, e aquilo que se lê em textos indianos já de bastante recuadidade. Então, o problema epistemológico, como sendo um problema que salta à vista do âmbito grego, e no âmbito indiano o problema linguístico. Então, nesse sentido, as tradições já apresentando caminhos, né, distintos e cuja diferença faz com que o interesse seja ainda maior, né? Ele fez algumas menções curiosas sobre o problema histórico, quer dizer, essas anedotas que correm, né, nas fontes gregas sobre algum contato com a filosofia indiana e também o desejo de alguns gregos de ter contato com a Índia. Se sabe disso, por exemplo, sobre Piro, né? É uma fonte em que se fala ou de uma viagem de Piro à Índia ou de algum tipo de contato. Depois disso nós temos o Plotino, né, que parece que tentou ir, mas não conseguiu chegar lá, segundo me contaram nesses dias, né? E que nesse sentido, quer dizer, se os próprios gregos, então, do período antigo, tinham um entendimento que havia alguma espécie de conhecimento lá que era digno de se ir até lá buscá-lo, né? Porque nós não podemos ler essas fontes com seriedade, né? E tentar, inclusive, ir além e descobrir mais acerca dessas, em princípio, anedotas, né? Ele depois mencionou esses personagens indianos que fizeram parte das anedotas gregas, ou como Calano ou o Díndimo, né? Calano foi aquele que teria se queimado, né, diante do exército de Alexandre. Ele falou, por mais que sejam entendidos como figuras mais religiosas do que filosóficas, ainda assim a própria referência a essas figuras traz um elemento conceitual que sustenta a ação problemática que eles tomaram, como por exemplo de queimar o próprio corpo, né? A partir daí fez menção ao que está dito em alguns livros mencionados aqui, com o fato de que havia, né, na soldadesca persa a presença de indianos e presença de gregos, quer dizer, havia na verdade muito mais contato do que aquele que as fontes históricas têm querido reconstruir, digamos assim, né? Em resumo, né, por que não se pode pensar então, a partir dessas fontes, né, que há um lugar estabelecido para a filosofia indiana já parte de algum conhecimento produzido pelos próprios gregos, né, em certo sentido. A partir daí, ele entrou no problema dessa escritura, né, da filosofia. Foi o ponto em que ele falou um pouco mais detalhadamente essa questão epistemológica e fez inúmeras referências ao problema da linguagem na filosofia indiana e fez algumas leituras a partir do seu handout, né, mencionando como o problema da linguagem ele já se articula de uma maneira bastante sofisticada, complexa e às vezes impressionante em fontes extremamente antigas da literatura indiana, que ele não chamou propriamente de filosofia, mas tentou pensar nessas fontes como sendo um tipo de início possível, né, para aquilo que depois viria a se desenvolver numa forma textual mais reconhecível como filosofia, né. Fez a menção, por exemplo, de autores já mais modernos, como Mark Twain, por exemplo, quando ele falou do problema dos níveis linguísticos, do problema do signo, do problema da solução dos paradoxos, todos esses problemas envolvendo a linguagem que, de certa maneira, são, na visão dele, uma antecipação daquilo que a própria filosofia ocidental tomou como uma espécie de, digamos assim, a última moda em filosofia, digamos assim, né, que é a filosofia analítica, até se tem o nome, né, de linguistic turning point, né, para a filosofia moderna, e ele aponta que na Índia isso já é um elemento estrutural, instaurador, né. Para tentar concluir, eu estou tentando. I'm trying to be fair. I took a lot of notes.
Did I say so much nonsense?
Em resumo, depois de todas essas referências que ele fez, ele tentou apresentar então uma proposição. Quer dizer, já que a coisa é assim, já que é preciso se colocar num trabalho contínuo de recuperação e de repensar como nós escrevemos essa história, o que pode ser feito no nível prático, no nível do ensino, especialmente no nível do ensino universitário. Tem um problema óbvio e inicial, que é como tomar contato com essas línguas e com esses textos, né? Esse problema é de difícil solução, ele pode ser atacado com o tempo, mas há algo mais rápido, mais fácil de se fazer, seria uma espécie de mudança curricular para se pensar o currículo universitário do estudo de filosofia sob a perspectiva global. Quer dizer, um currículo que não fosse mais um currículo grego, mas, digamos assim, um currículo global, e que se pudesse ler ao mesmo tempo, na formação em filosofia, os estudantes que já se iniciam nisso, algumas fontes gregas, algumas fontes indianas, algumas fontes latinas e talvez outras fontes que se considerar, como ele disse, útil, importante, ou de acordo com aquilo que um curso de filosofia quereria apresentar. Em resumo, a partir de tudo isso, então, o projeto é começar simplesmente, né, com a abertura da possibilidade de que esses textos sejam lidos pelos estudantes de filosofia já no seu processo de formação, para que se não tenha que discutir o problema da existência ou não de filosofia na Índia, né, sem ter lido os textos. Talvez os textos estando lá, o processo fique bem mais simples, né, a partir desse conhecimento que se dá de início pela tradução. E depois o interesse pode criar, a partir disso, grandes frutos. Creio que tentei ser justo e resumir o que o professor disse. Muito obrigado. Abrimos com as perguntas. Né? Não precisam me aplaudir. You don't have to clap.
Bom, a gente passou muito do tempo, mas acho que como você ainda fala dessa de encerramento, eu vou dar uns 15 minutos.
O professor aceita perguntas, se precisarem perguntar em português, eu tento traduzir para ele.
Aqui.
William. The corner?
Let me just correct one thing. I think Professor White's name I said wrong. I think I said Willard. It's Willard. Willard Van Orman.
Quem será o primeiro? Por favor.
Eu tinha uma questão, na verdade, era só as duas coisas que você me falou que eu peguei pela metade, assim. Eu vou perguntar uma só para o tempo. Vou tentar em inglês e português. Professor, here in my notes, I took some notes. You have mentioned that meaning is not a question of physical reality. It relates more to an image. but I couldn't understand the context of this saying. Então eu perguntei, ele falou sobre o sentido que estaria mais relacionado a uma, não estaria relacionado mais a uma realidade física, mas sim a uma imagem. E aí eu queria que ele falasse um pouco disso.
Just want to clarify that further meaning.
No, that's fine.
I was talking in the context of how paradoxes can be resolved, and there are four, not just one way, but four ways indicated. And I didn't really mention the fourth one. The fourth one is making a distinction between language and meta-language. When I'll come to your precise question in a minute, but let me add something that I missed. That is, so if you say everything I say is a lie, that's a sentence about your sentences. So it's a meta sentence, and therefore, there is no contradiction between what is at meta level and what is at the object language level. So that's one. Now, meaning as image, that is almost all people who have discussed meaning are required to say at some point. That is, I can use the word chair when the chair is not there. So every time I'm not pointing out to a physical object. When I say there is no chair, obviously I'm saying there is nothing that would produce the image of a chair in my mind. So one is required to go to a non-objective image meaning, picture-like meaning. That is not the ultimate solution to the problem of meaning. It's just one of the solutions. So if you say everything I say is a lie, the image of that sentence, the impression it has made on your mind, that is not really contrary to what you have said, because you have one literal meaning on one side and you have an image on the other side. That would be the case.
Alguém mais? Lilian.
I believe that for me and for students of Indian philosophy and other Eastern philosophies here, it's a very big problem. But I will talk particularly about Indian tradition. The summary of the question is PhD versus Pandit and Swami. Because the problem is that from the point of view of academy, if you are not a PhD on anything, you are not about to be heard or considered seriously, and much less to have your speech and your works or written works taken seriously for analysis or as a contribution. On the other hand, PhD is one certain cultural creation. And we have a similar one, which is particularly Indian, which is the Pandit, who studies at least the same that a PhD does. And we also have, for example, a Pandit may be an authority on grammar, an authority on logic, Nyaya or Nagya Nyaya, but in the sense of an authority on Raja Yoga, you have a Swami, sometimes a Paramahansa. I consider Swami Vivekananda ji a much greater authority on certain issues, even speaking in the 19th century about Indian philosophy and Advaita Vedanta, than many PhD historians and scholars of the West. But I must tell my students that they cannot use Vivekananda ji as their bibliography because he's not a PhD. So this is a very difficult situation, especially in the case of ancient people who have their own scholarly tradition. So I cannot really imagine a solution, but I would like to hear from you. How does it happen in Indian philosophy inside India? And how do you deal with that, or we can deal with that in academy?
it's a very serious problem. I agree with you. It's also a very difficult problem to deal with. Ultimately, we will have to bring Pandit, Swamis and university scholars together. That's one thing. And once they begin to understand that they really have complementary missions, useful from different results in society, things will be much better. That is true. But the other thing is, we have to reconsider our idea of a university also. Ultimately, at some point, if not for theoretical reasons, for excellent philosophical reasons, just because the corporations will be overtaking the university as an institution may disappear. That is a serious threat. That also you have to keep in mind. 2 days ago I heard that the Japanese education minister said all humanities and social sciences should be taken out of the university. I don't know whether the news is accurate or not. But if this could be said, I would have said take all sciences out of the university. Because almost every piece of information is available on computers now. The businesses are willing to pay for the training of the scientists. Why should the society bear the burden? Correct? A very good logical argument could be made for the opposite position. The point is, this is not ultimately going to lead us anywhere. What we have to say, that ancient India, in one sense, from our point of view, you may say it's very unrealistic and so on, but they found as good a solution as could be found. They created a class which was scholarly, which was not regularly paid wages, the value of whose knowledge was not measured in terms of money. The society considered it as an obligation to support them. The kings, rulers considered it an obligation to help them. Right now, that way will not seem attractive to us at all. But and they also made the same people judges, so you didn't have to have a separate institution of judiciary. They were not under the influence of the kings. Occasionally, they could speak their mind to the king, and without their permission, no punishment could be carried out. So that way, ultimately, is much more beneficial to the society. But we have, right, as long as possible, we are saying everything is measured in terms of money. Our social prestige depends on money. We have added a value dimension to money. We have also viewed that no one really can be so selfless. In many cases that's true. But it is also true that we can create a class which will be self-governing, which will be also subject to certain societal restrictions, which will be examined again and again. And ultimately we have to say that the objective should be to fair to people, not to go on the unscientific assumption that people are created equal. People are not literally created equal. That is obvious truth. Isn't that we should not be unjust to them. We should be fair to them. We should have an open thing, not because of a label someone should not be denied an opportunity. That is really the essence. But if I said people are not equal, immediately I will be misunderstood. Outside this hall, you are used to sophisticated thinking. You are used to saying what does the person really mean. But it's obvious that if your capabilities are different, my capabilities are different. Each of us has a unique combination, and we have created a huge structure called schools, high schools, universities, and most of the time it works all right. So we will probably not address the question anytime. That's going to.
So we're getting to almost 8 o'clock. There's almost 1 hour
Yes.
later. So we can have one more question and then finish. Professor needs to go to dinner. I need to.
Eu vou fazer em português uma pergunta.
Pode fazer.
É uma consideração. Depois você pode traduzir, por favor?
Claro.
É o seguinte, quando a gente pensa em português, a gente pensa num certo formato. Quando a gente pensa a cultura grega comandando, digamos, o Ocidente no seu pensamento, ela vai induzir uma maneira de raciocinar que não é como um hindu pensa, não é como um árabe pensa, porque o conjunto do ideário, de como eles fazem, como eles concebem as coisas. Então, ele falou da tentativa de sair da caixa, de pensar fora da caixa, num certo sentido. Quer dizer, você tem que considerar que os Upanishads, os Vedas, etc., que são muito anteriores à cultura grega, evidentemente que existe toda uma conceituação filosófica por trás muito mais antiga do que a cultura grega. Então os caras já eram filósofos, porque como é que você separa a filosofia da religião assim? Então o que eu quero dizer é o seguinte, tentando pensar fora da caixa e assumindo que existem diversas formas diferentes de você sentir e pensar, por exemplo, como sente um pajé indiano, ou como sente um guru indiano, ou como sente um árabe, por exemplo. As pessoas alguns têm maneiras de pensar mais grupais, se contrapondo ao pensamento individualista. É como se as pessoas pensassem coletivamente, andassem. Os árabes têm muito isso, por exemplo. Os hindus também têm isso, eu sei que tem. E outros grupos pensam, mas como ele mesmo colocou, o que foi colocado é que, de uma certa maneira, o pensamento dos últimos 100 ou 200 anos, guiado basicamente pela dialética grega, basicamente
Mas qual que é? Eu não estou entendendo a sua questão.
A questão é, ele colocou como pensar isso fora da caixa. Então, como juntar, propor que nos ensinamentos, que foi o que ele colocou, né? Que nos ensinamentos universitários, a abrangência pudesse ser maior do que a cultura grega e hindu, mas realmente envolver ao máximo as diversas formas de filosofia que não são consideradas como filosofia, mas que são parte de todas essas culturas antigas todas. Os índios, nossos pajés.
Você está perguntando como fazer isso?
Eu estou sugerindo, eu estou propondo apenas.
Mas essa é a proposição que ele está propondo. É que eu não sei como te traduzir.
Eu achei lindo isso, eu achei linda a colocação dele.
Eu direi isso, não. O professor is just saying that he found very beautiful the way that he proposed that we should think out of the box and try to include as much as we can of the heritage of global thinking into the study, the serious study as philosophy. I think it's basically that. It's fine for you?
If universities don't go beyond narrow confines, who will in society go? We are charged with this responsibility.
Sure.
At least, whether we create a different kind of educational structure, social classes, that's a very tall order. But we can at least change the curriculum and say this is the result we want, and this is something we have to do. Yes, nations will be used as a convenient tool only, not as really putting one section of humanity against another or some kind of competition. We say we teach whatever is good in different traditions of the world, and sometimes that good will come out of even showing the negative things humanity has done. That's possible. But that's a change we can do in our place of work, in our sphere of responsibility.
I just make one very short question.
No. You can't.
He arranged the whole thing. Let the poor
You deserve it.
have the last word.
Professor, I just want to say that I like your lecture very much, and of course I agree with you that we should be studying Indian philosophy and recognizing it as such. But what I'm concerned about is the kind of argument that one would give when we recognize that these traditions are different, and yet at the same time we want to call all of them philosophies. So if we are already recognizing these differences, what arguments would you give to defend the idea that despite the differences we should be calling all of them philosophy? What would be the justification for that?
Because in this study of human traditions of thinking, we do not go by authority, we go by logic, we try to make sense, we try to understand them as correctly as possible without bringing our personal preferences into play. And we are open to adjustments all the time. So learning all that as a habit of the mind, cultivating it as a mind, that is the way. And for that, that is the thread that binds all these things together. And that would be the justification. Okay.
Thank you very much. That's it. Thank you, Professor.
Bom, então, encerrada a jornada, muito obrigado.